Thank you so much for being here for this important episode of Talks with Dr. Shafer featuring Jeffery Morehouse. Jeffery Morehouse and the Bring Abducted Children Home organization are asking you to join them September 10th in Washington, D.C. at the congressional hearing on international parental child abduction. If you aren't able to join them, they ask that you tell a friend who can, and that you join us as allies of abducted children around the world by signing up to be an ally at endchildabduction.org. Thank you so much for being here for this important conversation. Stay tuned at the end of the show for a special announcement by Jeffery Morehouse to learn how you can help.
You've had that experience, and I'm sure many of your audience has too, whether it's their own children or a niece or a nephew, and you're at a park or a playground, and you look up from your phone and you can't find them, right? And it's that split moment, and the panic sets in, and then you spot them, and everything's okay again. But that feeling, and I know you felt it, and I know many of your audience members have felt it, that's what we experience. It just never ends.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Talks with Dr. Shafer. I'm your host, Dr. Shafer. I'm a physician, musician, life coach, mom, author, publisher, and I'm passionate about storytelling as a tool to help you reclaim your story and build your beautiful future. I'm so glad you're here. Today, we have a very special guest whose story is incredibly important to share, the story of Jeffery Morehouse and his son. Mr. Jeffery Morehouse is the executive director of Bring Abducted Children Home and the father of a child who was internationally kidnapped to Japan. Mr. Morehouse's son, Mochi, was kidnapped from the United States by his Japanese mother back in 2010, and despite Mr. Morehouse winning several court battles in Japan in which the court agreed that his son should be in Mr. Morehouse's sole custody, he has yet to see or hear from his son since his abduction. Since 2010, Mr. Morehouse has been working tirelessly to try to gain access to his kidnapped son, as well as to help other families whose children have been internationally abducted through his advocacy work. And I'm so grateful to have Mr. Morehouse here. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much for having me today, Dr. Shafer. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you and your audience.
We so appreciate you being here, and I can say that our collective hearts are crying for you and for the experience as to why you're here telling this story. But obviously, from the advocacy work that you've been doing, you found it very, very important to share this message and try to help your son and other victims of this. Could you tell us from the beginning what happened back in 2010 that led to this advocacy work that you're doing now?
Yes, absolutely. So I got started in this actually earlier than 2010. I had awareness of the risks with parental child abduction to Japan because a few years earlier, when my ex-wife and I were going through the divorce process, even prior to that, when I raised the issue of potentially getting divorced because we just weren't able to kind of repair the problems in the relationship, her response to me was, well, if we get divorced, I'll just take him to Japan and find a new father for him. As though I was a pair of shoes to be discarded and replaced. So that point in late 2006 was when I really started to understand the gravity of this. A couple of years later, when the divorce was finalized, I was able to get a travel and passport restraint in effect by an agreed order, meaning the judge didn't impose it on her. She agreed to these terms. And that was really necessary because of, again, these risk factors. And at that time, under federal law, there weren't the kinds of prevention measures that now exist today since 2014. As it led up to June of 2010, she alerted me through email that she was interested in getting a passport for him from the Japanese consulate in Seattle, where we were located. And one of the problems there is that was in direct violation of this agreed court order. Additionally, I had proactively, because of the threats of abduction, contacted all of the Japanese consulates in the United States as well as in Canada, imploring on them to follow the agreement of the court order and not issue a passport for our son. In the intervening time, when I refused her request to contact them to let them know it was okay to issue a passport, I then filed to extend this passport and travel restraint that was about to expire. And while that was happening, I went back to my lawyer, obviously, and we entered a new motion. She found a new attorney. We got what's called a continuance or a delay in the hearing. And with that, I requested that the travel and passport restraint be extended until that hearing date. And this was really integral in the legal process that we can maybe get to through this conversation. It really set a good precedence, although it hasn't allowed my son and myself to reunite as of yet, but it really helped me as the case went on overseas. As we moved closer to the hearing date, it was about the time that she was about to have 1 week summer vacation time with our son. I was the custodial parent here in Washington State, but she had visitation time and she enjoyed those opportunities, as did he, I think. So on Father's Day of 2010, I dropped him off to visit his mother. And that was the last day I've heard from my son or seen him. About a week later, I was coming back from a hiking trip and I was traveling through the middle of the state and I got a call from the police. And they asked me, do you know where your ex-wife is and where your son is? They've been reported missing. And I instantly knew what happened. So during all of this time, I always carried certified copies of all relevant court documents, electronic copies. I always traveled with a laptop with me. I was living on high alert that entire time period. And then the unimaginable really happened. So at that point, when they said that to me, my first response was, you need to issue an Amber Alert. I didn't know the rules and regulations and the interpretation of the Amber Alert. I certainly do now because I work with folks that do Amber Alert technical training. Their response to me is, we can't. That they would only issue an Amber Alert if somebody witnessed a violent abduction or witnessed her doing something. And since there was no witness, the best they could do was call the FBI, only when I implored them to do so. And so I quickly found out after, through the course of that afternoon that they had departed on a plane to Japan 4 days earlier on a Wednesday. As the investigative process, which was partially on me, law enforcement did a limited amount, and they arguably did more because I had legal strength going into the case, but I was doing my own investigation. I was calling the Japanese consulates all around North America. I had family members doing it. I was using personal contacts that I had in the Japanese community. And I also, at that point, I was able to get engagement and a little response from the Portland consulate of Japan, somebody senior in their leadership at the time. And that person acknowledged, after I pressured him, that they in fact issued a passport for her. So she actually went to another jurisdiction because she had been rejected by the local consulate of her own government. As I got into deeper discussion with them, they admitted that there was no way they could have issued a passport to her unless she told them verbally that she had located me and that I had agreed to the issuance of the passport. And clearly I wouldn't have done that. They offered no responsibility for this, even though they were absolutely complicit. And so my first response to them was, is this a crime under Japanese law? And they acknowledged that, yes, it was. They wouldn't specify exactly how she got the passport, but they gave that hypothetical that I mentioned. They would ask, if she knew where I was and if I agreed to it. And so they actually sent me a copy of the statute. And so my response after I reviewed that was to request that the prosecutor for the crime under Japanese law invalidate his passport, which was illegal and fraudulently gained, and return him to the United States. Within Japanese government, and I don't think it's limited just to Japanese government, I've dealt with this with our own government too, they will kind of slow walk a response to a question. But the Japanese government, I've seen them do this almost to an art form, where they will claim that they're studying it or somebody else is reviewing it, and they just extend it until you give up. But I don't give up, and I kept pushing it for about a year. And finally, they asserted that they just wouldn't do anything about it, which I find very interesting. You know, if you're trying to promote that you're a country of laws and protecting people, and you actually don't prosecute people when they violate those laws, that's highly problematic. And it points to, as I learned as I got more involved in advocacy, this wasn't the first case where the Japanese government had issued a passport under circumstances that were suspect or possibly even had complicity of an inside contact. So looking at my case and this other case where they did this, I think we can reasonably make the argument that they had assistance in these cases from their government, and then for the Japanese government has a level of complicity in my son's abduction and this other case that I mentioned.
I, as a parent, my heart goes out to you. And I know in this global age, there are many people who either with an intact relationship or post-divorce, or perhaps they've never been married, they are or they aren't together, but they've had a child with someone who is from a different part of the world. It's not uncommon anymore. And we can all potentially see ourselves in that. We know children. To have your child abducted, it's unimaginable. So when you were able to understand what happened, now the next step is, where do we go from here? How do I get him back?
Right. Well, you know, before I talk about that, you mentioned the unimaginable component to it. And that's really true for a lot of people. Even when I've talked to them about whether it's my case or the issue, it usually takes 2 or 3 conversations for it really to sink in, whether it's a parent coming to our organization because they have concerns, and yet that barrier of not being able to really imagine that that person that they love, that is the father, the mother, the parent to their child, might be doing this. And then additionally, you know, when people say, you know, boy, you know, I feel for you, I can't imagine. You've had that experience, and I'm sure many of your audience has too, whether it's their own children or a niece or a nephew, and you're at a park or a playground, and you look up from your phone and you can't find them, right? And it's that split moment, and the panic sets in, and then you spot them, and everything's okay again. But that feeling, and I know you felt it, and I know many of your audience members have felt it, that's what we experience. It just never ends. And it can be brought up again at the supermarket or going for a walk. You know, it might be a sound or a child similar to the age of my son, for me anyway, and a gesture or something in the color of the hair, the way he might tilt his head. And it brings you right back. That's something that the parent community faces every day. And it's not something that's really commonly understood, I think. People don't know how to process it, that aren't experiencing it. And I feel that in some cases there's a sense of, well, it's been 5 years, you must have moved on, 10 years. You know, how do you move on when your child has been kidnapped and you have some sense of where they might be? So you asked, what do I do next? What did I do next after my child was abducted? So there were a couple of things. First of all, there was a change in the legal structure of the parenting plan or the custody order. And for me, it was a small adjustment because I already had a sole custody, or what is interpreted as sole custody under federal law based in Washington state. But a lot of parents that we work with, they maybe didn't have that. In fact, I would say the majority of the cases, if the father is the victim, they probably didn't have primary custody because the national standard is generally 80% custody for the mother and 20% toward the father. So they've had to gone back into court in all likelihood to make an adjustment to that custody order. So you're dealing with that. If you have the resources. If you don't have the financial resources, you can try and represent yourself. But I think many judges can be a little dismissive of that process, especially if you get into the technicalities and the reasons why you might need that. So there's a whole community of parents victimized by this that have had their children kidnapped internationally. They can't even begin to fight the legal process.
I think it's an important point to make, because in this international community that we're living in, right, we have people from all walks of life with all different access to resources and education, right?
Yeah, right.
Or but they're potentially living in a part of our country where maybe their police presence is not strong, right? Or there might be some issues that are compounding the issue that makes it hard to even report, or they don't even know where to start. Or there are immigration status issues that get in the way also of reporting and advocating for your right to be with your child. The problem can just blossom and become so big that it feels insurmountable. But that's why you're doing this incredible work to advocate for people, to try to lead them to resources and avenues to take them from where they are now, this feeling of hopelessness, to working towards reunification, towards being able to have access to their children.
Yeah, absolutely. So for all the reasons you just mentioned, and then in addition, what we've seen is sometimes law enforcement doesn't know what to do, especially if we're talking about a smaller jurisdictional area. They may just throw their hands up and say, don't know. So what we try and do is provide tools and guidance based on my 14 years of experience, other colleagues, whether it's here in the United States or overseas, depending on the component of the case. We reach out, we compare different strategies to help give the parent that reaches out some sort of methodology to work forward. In fact, that comes in periodically each month. I had an email a couple of days ago, so I'm in process of setting up a meeting with a parent that has had an abduction case to see how we can help provide guidance for them so that they have some sense of control of a process. So one of the ways we do that, because a lot of our work has been working in Congress and developing a methodology of working with members of Congress, your representative and your senators. That can be a scary process for a lot of people. Or there's a cultural belief sometimes that those politicians that we elect to do those jobs, to work for us, are not interested, that they only serve other communities, or they only serve business interests or lobbyist interests. That's not true. There's a way to get help, or at least get in the door, and then the work relies on the parent to do the work. I don't have the time to manage every case. I can give you the tools, and you can check in, and we can provide guidance on how to make it more efficient. And I'll go in and meet with you, with your members of Congress and their staff, to try and help you through the process. So that's one of the ways that we provide assistance.
Talking about the advocacy and kind of the next step. And okay, so now you're dealing with law enforcement. They're not, I understand, maybe not as well versed as they needed to be. So you had to become a quick student of something, although you'd already been doing the work in years prior.
Yeah, so exactly right. So law enforcement isn't always on top of it. And I've seen that come up a couple of times significantly in my work over the years. And this is relevant, I think, to other parents that are dealing with this because they've experienced this. And so one of the things is the FBI, which one would think would assist you in an international parental kidnapping case. And there is actually a federal statute specific to international parental kidnapping. So it shouldn't be that you're bringing anything new to them. However, what I've seen over the years in my work, and we had some assistance from a couple of senators in writing a letter that basically I wrote the letter and they kind of tweaked it and sent it off, but got a response from the Attorney General, which then showed that less than 2% of these cases are pursued under the federal criminal statute, which then got me to dig in deeper. Why is that? So I went back in and looked at General Accounting Office reports. So these are government reports that can be on any topic that a member of Congress has interest in having studied. And these reports that I was looking at were 25 years old, 20 to 25 years old. And I saw within it that the Department of Justice back at that time responded they wanted to defer criminal approach to civil approaches under the Hague Abduction Convention, which is an international treaty that about 100 countries have signed on to. But it doesn't work that well because it's interpreted by each country. So if the country was a good actor in this area, in other words, if you had a case to that country, you could go through a legal process and have a fair shot of having your child returned to you where you could bring them home. They typically would continue in that path when they become a Hague signatory. If they were a bad actor, like Japan was and still is, they didn't really improve. And this was similar with countries like Brazil. India is a top 3 worst offender as well, along with Brazil and Japan. But India is not yet a Hague signatory country. So the concern there is if and when they eventually become one, it actually won't help anything. So going back to the law enforcement side, I had to become educated in federal law so that when I went to the FBI and requested they investigate to criminally indict her under this federal statute, I would have a solid argument for incentivizing them. And I say incentivizing them, and I really do kind of mean that because I think they are overwhelmed with a caseload. And it's been my observation and through conversations with agents that I've gotten to know over the years that there is a prioritization that is made. And that prioritization comes down to a relationship with the assistant U.S. attorney's office in the district that you're living in. And will they have a likely opportunity to successfully prosecute the accused? And I believe this is common also in state and district prosecution as well. They want wins. They want to use the taxpayers' money where they can to be most effective. And when it's an international parental kidnapping case, it's very difficult to get the perpetrator back to the U.S. But for the parent, there's important value in this, or there can be. It can create challenges in some cases with a Hague abduction application for return in that foreign country. But there's a strategy where one doesn't have to risk the other. So if you can get the FBI involved and they can pursue the case, then that opens up an opportunity to have the case submitted to what's called Interpol. So people listening and watching may have familiarity with Interpol through TV, and it's not quite like that. You know, they don't go in and they don't go in and investigate and arrest people. It's simply a notification system that would say the law enforcement in the U.S. is wanting this child returned, and you can get what's called a yellow notice issued, or we want this perpetrator returned for some sort of crime here, like an abducting parent. but it will require the FBI to make that entry. And they're not going to make it unless they have a criminal case. So I had to learn also about extradition treaties in this process. So I went and researched that and read the extradition agreement with Japan. And I looked at translations of Japanese law, because when you get into extradition, you typically have to have what's called comity, or the law has to match up. It has to be a similar or comparable crime in the US and also that destination country. With Japan, kidnapping requires an element of force or fraud. Since we had the passport fraud, now we just needed evidence. When I got into the civil case in Japan, after my ex-wife kidnapped our child there, about a year later, she filed for custody under Japanese law. Japan being a sole custody country, which says either the mother or the father has the child, and the other parent has no longer any right legally to that child. That opened up an opportunity where I had to fight it in court there in order to at least preserve my legal status. Within that case, she admitted to illegally gaining this passport. And I was able to take that and then meet with the federal prosecutors in the Seattle area, as well as ones that were conferencing in DC. And I really had to present a case to them. Bunch of lawyers in the room. I'm not an attorney. I've been mistaken for one several times in the past after doing this work for so long. But I had to lay out an argument why it was worth their time. So there were a lot of hurdles in the process. And had my case not had these unique facts to them and legal merit, I wouldn't have even gotten in the door. In fact, that actually reminded me, I didn't really get in the door. They weren't calling me back. I physically showed up at the office, at the Western District of Washington State office in downtown Seattle, and walked up to the window, and it's a big bulletproof window for their security. Very secure building, and I understand why. And I went up to the receptionist and spoke through the glass, and I asked for an attorney by specific name because I'd looked up online who handled criminal prosecution in that office. And she started to pick up the phone. And then by a stroke of luck, which is just being prepared for that opportunity, the door opened and somebody walked out, and it was the second person in charge of the entire operation there. It wasn't the assistant U.S. attorney, but the deputy underneath her. And she said, "What is this about?" So I walked with her, spoke with her, and she said, "Here's my number." I think she gave me her card even. She said, "I'll have a meeting set up in 3 weeks." Mm-hmm. And she did. And it was at that meeting that I was able to convince them of the strategy and get them to buy in to pursue prosecution. It shouldn't be that way. If you're a parent experiencing this, what it should be is they say to you, "Dr. Shafer, we've got this. You take care of yourself. Just try and eat well, get your rest, try and keep your job. You got to keep a roof over your head and pay your bills. Do what you can to take care of yourself and be healthy. We'll take care of all this. We know what to do." But it's not that. I feel I got better response many years ago when my car was broken into and something was stolen out of it than when my son was kidnapped. That's one of the reasons I continue to do this work, so that we can at least try and make some changes through our organization and our partners in the Coalition to End International Parental Child Abduction, which I helped co-found almost 10 years ago, so that if you're a parent that has been affected by this recently or in the future, there will be something significant, I hope, and we'll work towards getting, that will be there to help you through the process.
Mr. Morehouse, I am so grateful for the advocacy work you're doing and the real life changes that you are making in people's lives through your company, through the movement that you have, but also through doing the hard work, basically busting down those doors. Because as you said, if you're not there, if you're not physically there, it's so hard to have your voice heard. It's so hard when you're sending out emails, because most of us, if we're aware of a child abduction, maybe we'll tell our local law enforcement. Maybe we'll send a letter to our senator. Maybe we'll fill out that form online to the US government saying that you're aware of a child being abducted. But it's going out into what feels like a void. And if you're a parent, that void is just so full of pain and fear for the well-being of your child. And people who haven't experienced this, I've heard you talk about this before, how people said to you, I think from a good place, I would make the assumption they wanted to give you some peace that your son is safe, at least because he's with you, he's with his mother.
Mm.
But you knew that despite the fact that, yes, he's with this other parent, that he wasn't safe.
Yeah. Yeah. I think you're right, Dr. Shafer. People wanted to provide some hope in their inability to, and I don't fault them, inability to grasp what has actually happened. Because if you tell somebody this, anything, we experience, it's often, how does that affect me? Or what would I feel if I was in that situation? And this is the unimaginable, that the abductor could be the person that you wake up with every day. So I understand that they wanted to provide something. And yeah, I've heard that many times. It doesn't hurt the way it did in the beginning. Now I can point to different pieces of information. So, for example, the Supreme Court weighed in on that and cited the grave harm to children that are abducted by a parent. Through the years of advocacy work, and one of the things that I was very privileged to be part of was in the past couple of years, there was a revision of a Department of Justice published guide for families of missing children. And my colleague and I were brought into that, along with other families and parents that have had their children go missing. So the guide expanded beyond its original genesis, which was really focused on stranger abduction, to take it into areas like international parental kidnapping and luring that happens through the internet, and sex trafficking and other areas, and just plain runaway children. A lot of times, especially in the early years of my work, if I would tell somebody my son had been kidnapped, they immediately assumed that it was a stranger abduction. And once I explained it, then they pivoted to what you mentioned. Oh, well, at least he's safe with the mother. So there's also a cultural predisposition that I remember started after I kind of worked through the public education system as a child. I think during my sister's time, they started to introduce stranger danger that many people that are listening and watching grew up learning in school. But that's actually a very minuscule percentage of cases when a child goes missing. They're tragic. I'm not saying otherwise. But most of the time when a child goes missing, they've just gone missing. They've ran away. In more contemporary times, they may have been lured through the internet, or a significant category is when a parent or a family member has abducted them. And this happens domestically as well. I've connected to a community within the US that is struggling in different ways to get assistance when a child is taken by a family member from one state to another. So there are a lot of different facets to missing children beyond a common public perception.
How can we? I want to hear about your experience in court, because you did mention that. But while we're on the topic of how you interacted with people who hadn't had this experience that you had outside of the community that you're building of advocacy and support, having experienced interactions that were not helpful and hurtful in a time where you were already in your lowest place you could imagine being, is there something else that people could have done for you in that moment that would have been helpful, that you use to support people who are reaching out to you in these moments of unbelievable grief when their child has been abducted?
Mhm. I think that's a really interesting question. And I might have to think about that to really come up with something. But the closest thing I can think of on the fly like this is actually listen. Everything moves so quickly in society today. We're always on our phone. Many of us are always on our phones. Or if you're not on your phone, you're on your computer or your iPad. It's go, 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 go. What I try and do when I'm talking to a parent that is new to the experience, that has had their child abducted recently, or is concerned about having their child abduction, what I would call a prevention case, is I'll try and give them as much time as they want. Even if it is a story that I've heard 100 times before, because there's so many overlaps. It's important that that parent is listened to, is heard, because that's something I remember experiencing. Nobody really understood. Or they didn't give me a feeling that they were interested in really understanding. They were looking for a clean, easy way to offer something and then move on. What I did back in that time period, because I very quickly ramped up into advocacy, and I was always doing things on social justice issues at different points in my life, whether it was in college or after college, not in a leadership level per se, but I was not one to back down from an injustice. I was much more likely to run toward it and stand up and speak out and support others that were. So even though it hurt, I would deal with the pain later. I would look for an opportunity of what can I leave that person with so that they might have a little bit better understanding going forward, and not just walk away from it and thinking, oh, that poor guy, or that poor guy and his child. Whether it's understanding the frequency of it or the ability to look for warning signs around them, or to pay attention to those warning signs that we have in life intuitively that we sometimes look at and go, well, it can't really be that. So it was always, for me, and still is, a teaching moment.
Leaning into listening is so incredibly powerful. One, because someone like yourself, I'm thinking of challenges I've faced in my own, custody experiences. I don't want to call them battles because I don't want to use that language, but certainly it can feel that way sometimes. And you're focused on trying to do what's best for your children. You're focused on trying to keep them safe and staying out of, your ego and any feeling of possessiveness over the child in question for any particular case. But what are we trying to accomplish here? Safety and a good life for our children. And you had already gone through that process here in the States. You were granted sole custody of your child with visitation. And even the way you discuss your ex-wife's relationship with your son, you were clearly very, very respectful of wanting to foster that in a safe way. And despite all the knowledge you had, even before his abduction, and despite your ability, your superhuman ability to get yourself in those positions, to speak to important people who could really be doing actionable things to help you, to speak to Congress to try to move this issue forward, to go to Japan, to have the ability to go to Japan and have those court cases where you were awarded custody, sole custody of your son, and yet you haven't seen him or spoken to him.
Just for clarification, they actually didn't grant me sole custody there. They acknowledged the pre-existing U.S. custody order had legal effect there.
I see. Can you explain to us the gravity of that decision, how that plays out in that country with regards to you getting access to your son?
Yes, absolutely. So how I believe that plays out there is they didn't want to overturn or attempt to accept jurisdictional control over the case, because I proactively included a clause in it that said if there was any jurisdictional issue, in other words, if she tried, or more simply put, if she tried to take a case in Japan, it should not be heard by the Japanese courts, and they should return it to the U.S. courts because we had jurisdictional control. And because of that, I think it warned them a little bit that they might be weighing into something that could have political implications. So the way around that was to deny her motion for sole custody and leave things status quo, which means because she had visitation rights to our child, they left that intact and ignored all the substantive points in the legal ruling that would have returned him to my custody or even given me access to him. If they had awarded me sole parental authority, or what we would call sole custody in kind of the best interpretation of the language, then her legal rights would have been entirely stripped under Japanese law or the system. I haven't ever seen that really done there, even in domestic cases. It's possible it has been, but that would have been a monumental legal precedence. And they are much more prone in Japan to maintain the status quo, regardless of how we get there, which is why in Japan, they have an enormous problem, a crisis problem with parental child abduction. Based on divorce and child, how many children aboard statistics, a statistical model that was done by a law professor many years ago projected that upwards of 150,000 children every year in Japan lose access to a parent. And so lawyers in Japan, some of them, I'm not going to say they all do this, but since they get a percentage of child support, they are even more incentivized to win than they would be under a U.S. family law system. It's common practice that they would advise the parent, the mother or the father, take the child, go to your parent's hometown, hunker down for 6 months, and we have now established de facto custody, and then we can just push it through the courts. Or they will take the parent and push them into a domestic violence shelter, regardless if there's any real evidence, because they don't require the same evidentiary, discriminatory practices that we would here. In other words, one of the things that's common in Japan is hearsay. If any of your audience isn't familiar with that, it's you told me something about something you witnessed, and I repeat it as though it's fact. In Japan, that's accepted. Here, it's not. And so you have a wide berth to claim domestic violence in Japan, which can then add to maintaining the status quo. So that's one of the other problems. So since they didn't give me sole custody under their system, I was then reliant on the court to provide a reunification plan. And they rejected that. They refused to do so. Even though my attorney in the first case, for example, when I said to her, can I go pick up my son and bring him home? That was the natural conclusion or assumption on my part based on the ruling. They said the U.S. order has legal effect in Japan.
Right.
So that would have said he never should have been taken. So ergo, I should be able to bring him home. And she said, yes, you can do that, but you should really get your wife's permission first. Why would I need her permission if I have a legal order? So there are challenges even if you get an order in Japan.
And did you have any way to even contact your ex-wife to even ask her that?
No. I know where her parents live because I stayed in that house before we were married and when we got married. And I've visited that house since then. I've sent letters. Everything gets rejected. In fact, on one trip when I went out there, and this was, I think, in 2012 for New Year's Day. New Year's in Japan lasts 3 days. It's the biggest holiday in the country. The closest equivalent might be in the US. A lot of times people will spend time with their family on our Thanksgiving holiday. Japan does that for New Year's. Everyone would go home typically if they have a good relationship. So I thought that's the best chance of maybe being able to see my son, bring him a New Year's present. And so I went out there. It was a part of Japan that has a lot of snow in the winter, and it was snowing while I was there. I couldn't quite remember where the house was, and this was a time when Google Maps wasn't as robust as it is now. So I'm working from memory, rudimentary, rough maps from Yahoo Maps at the time, and a compass. And I'm walking in the middle of the night in darkness because it's a small village neighborhood. And I wanted to make sure I found the house before we approached it with the gift, with a Japanese citizen with me to document it for my own protection. When we actually went there, the grandmother then shut the door in my face, and we heard her on the phone. The Japanese person that was helping me, he called out to her in Japanese and tried to engage her. She refused to come out, and eventually we left after a few minutes. Later, I found out she simply called the police. So this is a common scenario, too, when the seeking parent, the parent who's had their child abducted, attempts to go to the grandparents' house, say in Japan. They can simply call the police and say, well, he shouldn't be here, or some foreigner is here, something to project that you somehow are the perpetrator here. So you get almost re-victimized. And I don't mean victim as in helplessness, but you get put back in that position again and traumatized in a different way while you're simply trying to connect with your kidnapped child. So I haven't had any communication with him since Father's Day 2010 when I dropped him off to visit her. The only information I've gotten indirectly was in the case that concluded in 2017. So this was a document from the fall of 2016 when he had an attorney representing him in the second case there. And the attorney reported that he asked my son, do you ever think of your father? Sorry. And he starts crying and says, sometimes I dream of him at night. That actually really was so meaningful. And it was so heartbreaking too, because to me, it felt like he had nobody that he could trust to talk to about what he's experiencing. But he was still holding on to that. So I'm still trying to find him.
And that love and connection, it will always be there. He's your son. And it will exist next to the grief of this time that you've missed. I want to know at this stage in his life, because he's now entering into a different phase of his life all these years later because of his age and development since then. Now that he's of this adult age, what different tools does a family in your position have to lend itself to reunification? Are there any? Are there other ways now that the age has significantly changed where you can connect with your children that you haven't seen in such a great deal of time?
I think that's a wonderful question. And in some ways, I'm pioneering or trying things, I should say. And others I know are trying what they can as well. One of the challenges with Japan is their law enforcement doesn't see this as a crime. So they treat my son as, at best, if you can get them to engage, as simply a missing person. No different than an adult that electively may have chosen to walk away from their life or may have actually disappeared through some sort of means, through an abduction. That's even if you can get a response. I was able to get a response recently, but that was only after developing an acquaintance relationship with a Japanese politician who offered to help and engage the national police to look for my son. Other parents I know that when they've gone to the police, they've been in Japan, they've been turned away. So there's not a clear path to do it. The internet's a great tool. That's something I recognized in 2010 and was trying to always put out information positively so that he could at some point, which as you mentioned, now he's a young adult, see and engage in and hopefully look for himself. So one of the factors in that continued me in that path is in, I think around 2015 at a conference that I would attend annually in Washington, D.C. on international parental abduction. I met a survivor who's an adult around the age I am, a little younger, who was abducted in the 80s, I think, as a teenager, and eventually was recovered after a year and a half or 2 years. And this was domestic in the U.S., and he said to us, and we were all seeking parents and activists on this issue, what he experienced, he had to discover for himself. There were articles written about his case, him and his brother. When he was reunited with his father, I'm sure his father told him certain things, but he said he spent a year, 2 years researching. He needed to know what was true and what wasn't. So because of that, for me, I made a personal choice. And if somebody asks me, I'll give them my opinion. And that personal choice is don't say anything negative about the abducting parent. This was recently kind of reinforced. I was introduced to a website by a colleague of mine on alienation, and it was started parental alienation. So this was started by an adult in America, in the U.S., who claimed or said that she discovered what had actually happened to her when she turned 30 or so. So it's not something that magically changes at 18 the way some people I've talked to think will happen. And I've had people tell me that too. Well, he'll be an adult soon, or he's an adult now, so I'm sure he can reach out. It doesn't work that way. This is years of conditioning. One of the things I learned several years ago, too, from the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children and their reunification staff, is that children that are abducted by a parent are told one of four things, typically. Either the other parent is dead, so the abducting parent can erase the interest in looking for the parent, right? The other parent doesn't want them. They've abandoned you. I haven't abducted you. They discarded you. It's another way of, I think, minimizing the interest in locating them. The other parent is dangerous, harmful to you, or is harmful to the abducting parent. So they're instilling fear in them and possibly even conditioning them to be the protector of the abducting parent while they're living this life of a kidnapped child. And then the more recent one that occurred in their experience was, and this is probably going to be more limited only in a situation where a mother abducts, is I don't know who the father is. It could be in vitro fertilization, or I don't know who I had many partners and we don't know who it was. But it's another tool in trying to erase the interest in seeking out your other parent. So some of those, if you are putting out negative information, if I was bad-mouthing my ex-wife, that would play right into if my son is being told I'm a dangerous person or I was harmful. And so this young woman who started this movement, this website, to try and educate people from the child's perspective of alienation, she said, I am half my mother and half my father. So a negative statement about my mother is going to hurt me. So it's not productive, I don't think, in the process of trying to reunite with my son, to even get into a discussion of my ex-wife, unless it's something he's interested in talking about. And it goes back to what we were talking about too earlier, really listening. And I think that'll be a challenge, being disciplined, that when he does reach out, to listen to how he reaches out and what he is interested in and wants to say and learn, rather than all the things I might want to tell him. And there could be a lot. What does he need? And I've seen this in my advocacy work, and I'll just reference a couple of examples. A couple of years ago, a young woman emailed through our website, and we have some of the kidnapped children that were kidnapped to Japan listed there. These are all validated cases that were accepted by the State Department, and the parent had requested it. The seeking parent had requested their child or children be placed there. And we're very, very careful about making sure it's a legitimate case. So this young woman had emailed, you need to take that down. I was never kidnapped by my mother. If you don't do this, I'm going to talk to an attorney. I'm going to sue. There was a lot in that email. Yeah. So I contacted the father and was fortunately, after a few days, able to get a hold of him. And it turned out they had already reunited a little bit, which is great. So I just checked, would you like me to take it down? He said, oh, yes, I forgot it was there. Perfect. That's great. I'm glad it worked out that way. But she still, even a couple of years after whatever level of reunification they had, was still being held under this mythology that she had been controlled by. So that's one example. When my son reaches out, trying to really listen and gauge, how free is he? And how much is he still controlled by what he was held under during the 14 years and running of his abduction? Last year also, through this Japanese politician, I was introduced to a young American man who is a survivor. And he abducted to Japan, only found out at age 23. He's 26 now. And so there's a process to it as well. Again, it's not the switch on, switch off. That would be great. That's the Hollywood movie version, if there ever is one of these kinds of cases, because you got to tie up the story quickly. But it's really a process. And he's going through a different process than that woman, based on his own experiences. He's interested in being out there publicly. I don't know what my son is experiencing at this moment. Another facet to it, with Japan and other countries, but, I'll just use Japan as an example. Based on my research, there's data to show that adults in Japan tend to live with their parents in certain decades, in their 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, at a certain percentage level. that is higher than in the United States. And so when a child that has been abducted is still in the same household as the abductor, they are still psychologically under the control of that abductor. Some have compared it to being like a cult. The abductor is the cult leader. The child is a cult follower. The victim, the child in this instance, is going to arguably freer once they've left the household. So my son is 20 now. I don't know if he's going to college. Hopefully, maybe. If he is, he may be still living with his mother. Maybe he's moved out, and it's been a short time period. But in all likelihood, he's probably still living with her. So it might be too early for him to feel completely free psychologically to reach out, that he wouldn't be violating his mother's wishes by daring to contact his father. So that's another facet of it. And I saw this in another case, one of our other co-founders in his case. The older child, once she got out, had a family of her own, she was more inclined to reach out, and did, and they had a reunification. His younger child has not yet done that, but has conveyed to his sister, when he graduates, when he moves out, then he thinks he'll be ready to do that.
I think it's an important point that you raise. Culture is really important in our life experiences, and something that goes beyond culture, and it's just a biological imperative, is that our children bond with their caretakers.
Right.
Even if they are physically abusive to them, even if horrific things have happened, children are programmed to be able to try to see the best in their caregiver because that is their survival. And above anything else, our brain, our nervous system is directing us to survive because nothing else matters if we don't survive. So until in our culture, because in our culture as teenagers, we tend to have a little bit more wingspan and space to try to find our own way and practice independence in the safe, I hope, for this individual in this example, in the safe home that we're living in, if we're so fortunate. So for us, it's more normalized to be able to do that, but not every culture allows that. So if it's not safe for your children to reach out because their relationship to the person that is the most powerful in their life, and maybe for decades to come, depending upon the culture, the society they live in, that's really powerful. And I am grateful that you share that, because I imagine there are people listening to this that are drawn to this episode because you're here. They've potentially gone through this themselves, or loved ones have gone through this, and maybe have moments where there's some frustration there. Why haven't they found me? Why haven't they reached out if I think they're at this age where they potentially could? Trying to take that perspective of there are reasons, and just you being out there and showing this positive light, being very, really, truly parental in the best sense of the word, of saying, I'm here for you, right? I'm here for you in any way you need me to be. And I'm going to be a lighthouse here, and I'm going to shine this beacon so that when you're ready to find me, you can. What message would you want your son to hear now if he does hear this episode?
If he's listening or watching now, I would just want him to know how much I love him. And I'm here for him. If he's interested, he has an education opportunity here. There's some funding for him that he's the beneficiary of, that he's not aware of. And that's it. What do you need? I'm here.
That's beautiful. And I really pray that he hears this. And I'm so glad that you're here to share this message for him and for others. of course, we wish that it wasn't the case for you. I am so in awe and have such gratitude for people like yourself who experience such pain, and they're able to take that and make it into something that makes the world a better place, even though it came out of a horrific amount of grief and pain. And that's what you're doing. I want to cycle back a bit to prevention, because you did everything you could,
Right.
everything that you knew how to do, because, you know, your nervous system, you were getting these little hints from your interactions with your ex-wife, as well as things she directly said to you, that you needed to be on high alert for this. With the knowledge you have now through your research and your advocacy and all of the cases you've come in contact with, what would you say to someone who's in that similar position of feeling on high alert, of feeling, there's a risk of this, and how can I best prepare myself and my child to protect them as best I can from parental international abduction?
Thank you. So, yeah, prevention is really an important key. There are far fewer obstacles if you can prevent your children from being abducted than if they are abducted. One of the significant changes that occurred in 2014 was under a change in federal law called the Goldman Act. And I worked on that a little bit, and I'm working on improving it. Our organization is as well. But within that, it changed something under Homeland Security and Custom and Border Protection, so that if you have a court order, like the court order I had, you can get this entered into a federal database and put your child or children in a prevent abduction program, so that if somebody is trying to take your child out through one of the ports, like an airport, they will be flagged and removed from the line. And I've met with agents in Homeland Security that work in this specific area after the law came into play, because myself and my colleagues, we were very concerned that it was implemented the way the law was written. And we were assured that, in fact, it was working, and they took us through how that works. So if you're out there right now and you are concerned about your child being abducted to another country by your partner, first thing you need to do is get an order from your local court signed by a judge that states that the child, by name, is not allowed to be removed from the United States or your state or your county. Any of those will suffice. And then get in touch with the Department of State. But that may be a little complicated. So you could also reach out to our organization, whether it's through Bring Abducted Children Home or the Coalition to End International Parental Child Abduction. Both of them will get back to me personally, and I'll get back to you, or one of my colleagues will, and we can help assist you with your attorney on some of the pitfalls of that process to try and make it most efficient. And depending on what state you're living in, so some states have passed something called the Uniform Child Abduction Prevention Act, or UCAPA. And within it, it has essentially markers for risk factors for child abduction from a legal perspective. And then if that state has passed that into law, it guides or strongly suggests that the judge put certain restrictions, like the travel restraint I mentioned. So it can be sometimes a smoother process if you're in one of those states, but there are a couple of other states that have also adopted similar laws as well. Those are some of the things to do with prevention. If you can't afford an attorney, you could try reaching out to a university that has a law school attached to it. Do they offer some kind of pro bono services? They might. If you are, if you fit into a certain demographic, there may be legal services in your area and community that are pro bono or no cost. So it can be work sometimes to kind of turn over a lot of stones until you find the answer. But I would encourage you to, be persistent and really pursue prevention as best as possible.
Thank you so much for the incredibly important work you do, because as you learned on your journey, there was so much, even with being as prepared as you could be, there was so much you still had to learn, so many tools you had to figure out how to access and when and how. And I know you've discussed this in other talks, and I've heard other people in similar situations discuss that not every tool works for your situation, right? There may be specific components to your case where it would be better not to speak on social media at all, because it may have certain ramifications depending upon on the specific items of your case. And so I think it's really important to have, as you provide through your organization, a way to have someone to speak to, one, to just have that listening ear, like you said, so incredibly important, who's not going to give you false platitudes, but just give you a place of support, sit beside you on this journey, and then say, well, here are some resources. We have people here to help you, and we encourage you, if you can afford legal counsel, that you have that and can point you in the right direction. Because as you said, your legal counsel, your judge, your law enforcement department may not even know all the legalities and all of the particulars of how to best help you reunify with your child. So thank you so much for the work that you do. And I will be thinking of you and your son and the people you support, and hoping that you are reunified soon, and that he's able to hear this and other messages that you've put out there in the world and know how loved he is.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk to you today, Dr. Shafer. And for anyone out there that's interested in more or wants to help in some capacity, I would encourage you to go to our coalition website, endchildabduction.org, and sign up as an ally for kidnapped children. And just stay in touch. We continue to do advocacy work on changing federal law to improve both prevention and helping families. And so again, just go there, take a look, and sign up and keep in touch with us.
Well, count me in. I'm doing that right after the end of us taping this episode. I'm an ally, and I know there are other people in the audience that would love to support you and this important work you're doing. So thank you for telling us how we can do that. And please, we will certainly put all the links in the show notes today so that you have an opportunity to access those as well if you're listening today and you want to help. Make sure you follow along and you support this important work that Mr. Morehouse is doing. Thank you so much for being here, and thank you to our listeners for being here. Stay safe, take care, and I'll talk to you soon.
Join us on Tuesday, September 10th for an important congressional hearing on international parental child abduction. Let's show up in person, fill the room with families and allies, and send a united message to Congress. I look forward to seeing you in D.C. as we continue this important work together. If you can't attend, make it your mission to find a friend who will.
Everybody's lonely, but you can hold on to me, and I will try to make it right. Everyone needs something. Let me be that one thing, and I will try to ease your mind. I can't do